We're going to start with a prayer, and I would ask everyone to stand, and Tom will do the prayer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do the prayer. Thank you for asking me to do the prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray today for guidance as we do the work for the people of the territories. I pray that we're able to address the issues before us effectively, and I pray that we are able to do this with respect and dignity appropriate to the positions we hold. Amen.
Merci, Tom. There's an agenda before you. This meeting is a single issue meeting to have a public briefing on the document that was distributed, Developing a Sustainable Knowledge Economy in the Northwest Territories. The next item on the agenda is declarations of conflict of interest. Are there any? Seeing none, I would like to have the members introduce themselves, and I'm going to start on my right with Kevin. Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good morning, welcome. Corey Van Thine, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Tom Bollier, MLA, Tuneda Willide.
And we have on the phone
Shane Thompson, the Hendy. Welcome. I apologize. Just got to get back home to look for business. Sorry, I wasn't there in person.
No problem.
Good morning, Frederick Blake, MLA from Mackenzie, Nova.
Okay, thank you. And I'm Julie Green, member for Yellowknife Centre and deputy chair of this committee. On my right is Michael Ball, the committee clerk. On my left is Megan Welsh, the committee researcher. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, ask you to introduce yourselves and give your presentation. We have this room until 10:30. Welcome, and go ahead.
Thanks, Julie. I'm going to ask each of us to introduce ourselves one by one, starting with Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel McNeil, the Communications and Knowledge Translation Advisor for Hotii ts'eed.
And I'm Stephanie Irlbacher-Fox. I'm the Scientific Director of Hotii ts'eed.
John Bizo, the Chairperson for the Hotii ts'eed.
Jessica Simpson, researcher with Hotii ts'eed.
So this is our team. Thank you for taking the time to have us on your agenda this morning. We know how busy you guys are, but I'm hoping that you'll find this interesting and informative. The economy, of course, is always top of mind for, I think, all of us, but particularly people in decision-making positions, like yourselves, of course, the people who make our laws in the Northwest Territories. So we're gearing this presentation today towards the kinds of things that you need to think about in your work on a day-to-day basis. The knowledge economy is not really something that people talk about a lot. It's sort of a new term that really, while people have been talking about it as early as the 1930s, it's more and more relevant today because our economies around the world are becoming more and more based on knowledge, and that has a lot to do with technology, the internet, and the ability that gives people for different kinds of economic opportunities that are not about producing things or products like Western economies were dependent on for so long, but rather generating jobs, creating value through expert knowledge. First, I'll just start by going through the presentation that is up on the screens. So I plan to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to ask Rachel to time me because I forgot to put my timer in front of me. And then John is going to give a short presentation as well. The Clecho government is hosting Hotii ts'eed, and so John's going to talk about why they're doing that and the sorts of economic and capacity building benefits that they're getting out of Hotii ts'eed, as well as generally the importance of research and the knowledge economy for building economies in Clecho communities. So for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are one of 11 units across the country. Every province has what's called a SPORE support unit, which is the Strategic Patient-Oriented Research Strategy of the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Our role, like every other unit across the country, is to build capacity in health professional and health research training, and to connect researchers with patients so that health research is done better. The Yukon and Nunavut haven't got their units up and running yet. Ours was established about 2 years ago, and we really got up and running in January of 2018. So we've been functioning for about a year. We have.
When you want the slide to advance,
I'll
can
just
you
say
please-
next slide.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. So we have about 6 staff. We employ summer students. We create jobs across the Northwest Territories, and all of our employees are embedded with different Indigenous governments. So our focus is on Indigenous health research, promoting that, making it happen. Also working with Indigenous and other organizations to innovate health programs and services, particularly in communities. We also realize that we have a significant economic benefit that we can offer. By supporting research, that brings money out of the territory into the NWT. It also creates catalysts for getting more money. More money, of course, means local spending. It means jobs. We can estimate, from our perspective, the economic impact of that. But one of the things that we've found over the past year is that no one's really tracking the economic benefit of research in the territory. We think it's fairly significant. So in our role, we have been providing, for example, funding for Indigenous organizations to build their capacity, so for individuals to get training, to assist people getting programs off the ground, and the support that we are providing to Indigenous governments is actually getting into areas that have historically been a bit problematic. For example, we're focused on improving access to health data. So this is something for people doing health research is actually pretty important. For Indigenous governments, when they're planning programs and services, it's also fairly important. But data, whether it's held by Statistics Canada, GNWT statistics, there's a baseline sort of available to the public, but if people want to dig deeper, that's a little more difficult to do. So these are some of the things that we're focused on as Hotii ts'eed. And part of our mandate is also in trying to connect researchers and communities to do research, is to notice some of the barriers and figure out ways to address those. How do we make it easier to get health research done in the territory and to make sure that people are working with communities effectively, ethically, and in ways that boost the local economy? So first of all, let's talk about a knowledge economy. As I stated at the beginning, it's really using knowledge to innovate, to solve problems, next slide, sorry, and to create jobs and value. Next one. So I give some examples here about who's part of the knowledge economy. Education and training, a potential university, currently the college. Organizations like the Northern Farm Training Institute or Hotii ts'eed. So if you look at these, you can start to get a sense that there's actually quite a number of organizations that are part of the knowledge economy. Next slide. So who is involved in this? In the communities, of course, it's Indigenous knowledge holders and elders. And in small communities, those people are actually really important to the knowledge economy. Scientists and researchers, of course, other people who do training, yourselves as politicians, you work with knowledge to accomplish what you need to do. And then also we have a creative sector. So the filmmakers, the artists, using their imagination, their technical skills to produce things, but also to do things like put together festivals. And this leads into things like tourism as well. In the private sector, next slide. People involved in the knowledge economy are varied, everyone from lawyers to health professionals to people working in tech firms. Next slide. And in government, of course, areas like healthcare, education, land use, and wildlife monitoring. These are all people who work with their knowledge, they're creating jobs, they're providing services, and they're innovating. The last slide is, this slide here is one that we fall into. This is where government and sort of private sector meet. So we're all familiar with various organizations in the NWT where you have a couple people who have a great idea and they create something and they go out and they find the funding to do it. And they're creating jobs. They're also solving problems. And by solving problems in ways such as, for example, Foxy, building confidence among youth, teaching them about how to be more confident, how to make good choices in their lives, helping to grow, self-confident, high-functioning youth who will then turn into self-confident, high-functioning adults. And that is good for the economy. It's good for the society. So we can see that these kinds of organizations create capacity. They not only provide jobs in an immediate sense and maybe over a medium or a long term, but they're also building the economy by building capacity as well. Next slide. So why does it matter? Next slide. For Hotii ts'eed, we are providing economic benefits. We are watching how research and training builds individuals in communities, and that enables communities to have the skills and the confidence to be in the driver's seat when it comes to research. One of the problems that we find with research is there is this definite colonial hangover. Communities don't want researchers because they've often been burned by them. That's not happening so much nowadays because there are a lot of, a licensing process in place. Indigenous governments are empowered. They have research policies. But we do every year hear about situations where there are researchers essentially exploiting communities or doing research and not doing it in a way that is either ethically sound or that provides benefits or information back to communities. So it's difficult for communities a lot of times to want to engage with research. We think that if we can build research skills, if we can build the capacity for communities to feel confident in taking on directing research projects, then it opens up a whole level of potential economic benefit that for a number of communities hasn't been something that they're keen on exploring. Next slide. One of the things that we've observed is that the GNWT doesn't track the economic benefits of research. I don't think this is a matter of neglect. I think this is something that this is an area of the economy that's been building, and it maybe hasn't been so prominent until more recently. And I think that's something that has developed hand in hand with Indigenous governments becoming themselves more developed, with Indigenous individuals achieving higher levels of education and engaging in research themselves, and of course Indigenous communities becoming more empowered and insisting that Indigenous knowledge be included in research. But this is something, of course, that we think the GNWT needs to address. We need to start understanding who's doing research. Why are they getting money? Who's giving them money? How are they spending that money? Where are they spending it? What are the economic benefits? And what are the potential economic multipliers? If you spend $1 on research, how many more dollars does that create for small communities in particular? What we've seen in some GNWT departments is that while there's a research approval process with ARI, seems to work well, some types of research has to go through departments. If departments don't have specific processes in place, and if people in the department are not accountable to actually get these projects approved and well developed, that can result in researchers leaving. And we have seen that happen in some cases where people propose projects, they don't hear back for 6 months, or they're subject to constant back and forth with multiple people in a bureaucracy who aren't really talking to each other, and eventually they've left. What that means is that, that's potentially a job in a community that somebody didn't get. That's potential capacity building that didn't happen. And again, it's certainly not intentional. I don't think anyone would intentionally do that. But without having correct processes in place, it's logical that this is the kind of thing that could happen. So there's some room for improvement here. We are very much in favor of an NWT polytechnic. Part of the reason is that if we have a post-secondary institution that can access federal dollars, We're looking at tens of millions of dollars, federal dollars, new dollars flowing into the NWT economy, creating jobs for people who live here, bringing in highly qualified personnel as well from outside the territory. And I think that's something that the GNWT has wanted to achieve for a long time. This is kind of a no-brainer. We believe that Yellowknife has untapped resources. There hasn't been political will to build a campus in Yellowknife. To us, that doesn't make any sense. There are a lot of PhDs, a lot of people with master's degrees. The Yellowknife's Dene are nearby, as well as the Clicho. So it makes sense to us that the GNWT would look at building a purpose-built campus in Yellowknife that would serve the surrounding communities as well as communities across the Northwest Territories. If we can get things established in Yellowknife, it would also strengthen the potential to build in the small communities. And as Hotii said, we think that's really important. We're not here to build the economy of Yellowknife, and we've been really clear about that from when we were first established. We're here to build the economy in small communities, and we're doing that through hiring people and the other initiatives that we're undertaking. At the same time, we can't prioritize that at the expense of squandering the potential of what's in Yellowknife. And it seems like that's what's happening. And we're in an economic situation where in the NWT, we can't afford to do that. With the contraction of, one of our big sectors in non-renewable resources, we need to be looking at every way we can build this economy. Next slide. What we've also found is that where GNWT is doing knowledge economy work, it's really linking it with a sector that is declining. And it's doing that at the expense of more sustainable sectors. So this is typical of any country, any jurisdiction that has a lot of natural non-renewable resources. It's the low-hanging fruit. This is known as the resource curse. You depend on that economy, you focus on that economy, and meanwhile, there are other sectors of the economy that have potential, but they're not as easy. So we think it's clear we're at the point in the NWT where we have to go after those sectors that might not be as easy, but are certainly more sustainable for the whole territory over the long term. Next slide. And the next slide. So we have some pretty specific recommendations for the government of the Northwest Territories. Some would have to be led by the bureaucracy. Some we would hope would be taken up by the Legislative Assembly. So this is just basically a recap of what I was talking about. Build the Polytechnic, foster Indigenous knowledge in the various ways that there's potential to do that. Fund innovation, support training, not just in the mining sector, but let's build it for the other sectors as well. Improve internal processes. So what we're not asking for is for GNWT to throw a bunch of new money at this necessarily. Look at how things can be improved before we talk about spending new dollars. We also think it's important to develop a knowledge economy strategy. Next slide. So these slides really just sort of elaborate on some of the things that I've already covered. So building the NWT Polytechnic, a lot of really positive economic benefits come out of that. Next slide. Indigenous knowledge is an area that we think GNWT can support Indigenous governments to lead. We don't expect GNWT to take the lead on this. We think governments like the Clicho, Delaunay-Gautineau government, the Gwich'in, the Inuvialuit, the Decho, the NWT Métis, they know where their knowledge lies. They should be provided with the support to be able to take that knowledge and build their communities. Too often when government looks at Indigenous communities, they look at communities from a perspective of deficit. We look at communities from a perspective of strengths. What are the strengths that exist? We don't want to go out and try to fund a bunch of people to do their master's degrees or get PhDs. If they want to, we will do that. But what we would really like to do is meet people where they're at. And if there are elders, if there are young people who have Indigenous knowledge or want Indigenous knowledge, we're focusing on ways, how do we strengthen that? How do we approach communities in ways that don't tell them to change or become more like the mainstream or non-Indigenous people? We want to know what their strengths are and we want to support those. Next slide. Funding innovation. So a lot of times for government, the specifics on this, give people money and get out of the way. And that's also how we work with Hotii ts'eed. We want to provide people funding and opportunities. We're here to create opportunities. We're not here to tell people how to do it, who to do it with, or why they have to do it with certain kinds of people with certain kinds of credentials. We don't believe in that. We believe in supporting things like, for example, this great picture of the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation when they received the Arctic Inspiration Prize. They don't need us to give them PhDs or create policies for them or rules. They need us to help them achieve what they want to do in their own way. They're aware of standards. They're aware of all of the different elements of a program that they have to come up with. So they've come to us recently, for example. They want to know how they're doing. How is their program doing? So we spent time talking with them. We spent time thinking about it with them, and then we provide them with the means to do their evaluation. And we're looking forward to seeing the results of that and then understanding how we can work with them going forward. We would recommend a similar approach to government. Next slide. Supporting training, we think the GNWT has done a wonderful job, as has the federal government, in supporting training that really focuses on mining, the oil and gas sector, some of those other big economic sectors that are now contracting. We think it's time that if GNWT is going to invest in training, that the money should be going into programs that focus on things like local research skills, sustainable harvesting and food production, local energy sources, building houses, arts and culture, environmental monitoring. These are things that local people, without having to leave their community or go get university degrees, will be able to do. We know that we will always need people to go out and get their education, and I want to reiterate that we do support that. But there's a whole sector of our economy, of our people right now, who are not productive. And it's not because they don't want to be, it's not because they don't have the knowledge or they're not healthy, it's because there's no opportunity. And I think as MLAs, you guys have gone to communities and you've seen it. I've spent the last 20 years working with a lot of small Indigenous communities, and I saw it constantly. People want to work, they're willing to work, but there are no jobs. So let's create those jobs. Next slide. Improving legislation is important. What we would like to see, for example, is an overhaul of the Scientists Act. We would like to see any researchers coming to this territory tracked. What are they researching? Who do they get their money from? How much money are they getting? Where are they spending it? And then we would hope that GNWT would be able to run economic analyses on that to tell us how this is impacting the economy, what's the potential for growth. That would help you to target the kind of spending that maybe should happen, or other measures that could help this sector to grow. We think that those pieces of legislation should uphold standards. So scientists would have to get ethical approvals, that internally in GNWT, people approving research or working with researchers would be required to look at what's the economic benefit before they turn down a project or just neglect to look at it for a few months. Supporting knowledge workers, enabling creativity and innovation. So that's where, the Farm Training Institute, Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation, Indigenous Research Institutes, they're doing great things. Let's support them, keep out of their way, make it as easy as possible for them to do their work. Next slide. So this again relates to improving processes. And I think this is really about accountability and really probably educating bureaucrats, specifically in Yellowknife, about how important research is economically for small communities. Next slide. And the last, of course, is developing a knowledge economy strategy. This is not something where we want to see the GNWT go away and develop its own strategy. This is something where we would like to see the GNWT think deeply with its knowledge economy partners. When we're talking about building a university, the conversation should not be Fort Smith or Yellowknife. The conversation should be about how can we build something that will attract tens of millions of dollars in research funding that right now is going down south. For example, Laval got a $90 million Northern Research Centre built just a couple years ago. They're located in Quebec. And a big chunk of that money came from federal infrastructure. And it's going to be funded by Social Science Humanities Research Council, CIHR, and NSERC. They're going to be giving them grants. Those are grants going to a northern center. They're not going to come here. So these are the kinds of opportunities that if we want to build this university, we can access federal infrastructure money. GNWT can work with Indigenous governments. If Indigenous governments go to the Government of Canada and say they want this, and GNWT can go with them in partnership, the case for this will be a lot stronger. The Polytechnic, when we think about it, we need to think about who's going to benefit. Students for sure, people who work there for sure. But there's also all these other organizations that can benefit from it and also benefit this university. So if the university brings in students, students can also access programs at places like the Institute for Circumpolar Health, Dechinta. They can work with the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation. They can help support Aurora Tourism. There are so many possibilities where the Polytechnic University can partner with private sector and also with research institutes, and that won't cost GNWT anything. This investment will really help to support those organizations and build capacity that ultimately is something that will benefit the small communities as well. I grew up in Inuvik, and whenever I work on anything that is territorial, I'm always thinking about that experience. So how can we build on what exists in Inuvik? They have so much there. They have the satellite station. They have the college. They have 2 Indigenous governments that can access a lot of money for training and for research. So if a Polytechnic was built, presumably that campus would benefit, and it could specialize in those types of areas. I think of Hay River and the Farm Training Institute. What an amazing opportunity. That could become a campus that is a lot more than what Hay River has now. So I think this conversation a lot of times has been about how would building something in Yellowknife take away from Fort Smith? And the conversation should really be about how is building something in Yellowknife going to grow the economies in all of our communities, particularly in communities that are not really benefiting from the college right now, and where the real activity that you've seen have come from just really brilliant individuals who have a vision and they have creativity, and they've gone out and they've just built these things. And I think across the Northwest Territories, we have these people and these organizations, and they're not recognized really for the huge benefits that they're bringing to this territory. So this is something that when we're having a conversation about building a university, I would really encourage MLAs to think about, yeah, we need to build something in Yellowknife. I think that's a given. We need to do this in a way that is going to build all of the economies. So it shouldn't mean either or. It has to be a perspective where we're in an economic contraction. This is something that when you build a university, it doesn't really matter what sectors are rising or falling. It's something that will provide you with stable sustainability. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Bizot to talk a little bit about the experience of the Clecho government.
Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Irlbacher-Fox, and now I'm turning the floor over to Mr. Zoe. The man in the booth will control the mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I think I was saying earlier that the last time I made a presentation to a committee was probably in 2003, just before the Clecho Agreement was being ratified. So we have quite a bit of history, and there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. And everything is based on the premise that before contact, that we've always had Aboriginal rights and titles, which is the basis of moving forward with us and trying to describe in agreements that we have what those things are. the basis of engagement. And but since that time, there's been a lot of drawdowns from that original source, meaning that we're losing a lot of things that we had recognized internally, which has to do with knowledge in all sectors, knowledge on the landscape, knowledge about the animals, knowledge about the of how we do internal trade. And the equipment and the transfer of that knowledge to future generations, and that includes language, culture, and way of life. So that's very much intact, but in today's terms, especially with the early explorers, the first thing that they did was they drew down the ownership of the land and the say over those lands, and it became a crown lands over time. But after the early explorers, then the trade became established, and so the drawdown for the trade became foreign to us, that now we have to feed into that system. And that has a lot to do with the resources from the land, which is the animals, to feed that trade. And eventually, when the treaties were established, there were a further drawdown of non-renewable resources, mining. And we know that in this area, mining has been very active, and the benchmark is Yellowknife when we start talking about the 1930s, when the thing was being developed. But one of the things to remember is that we didn't have any employment in mining until 1996, okay? And that's very recent. That's only 20 years ago. And one of the reasons for that is because the treaties that were made were never implemented, but we were placed under the care of the Indian Act. And so everything, every relationship we had was only with Indian affairs that kept it corralled. And there's no way that anybody can dip in there unless they were authorized by Canada. And one of the authorizations, the early authorizations that they gave, was for education to the churches, which is an entity of government. And that's the beginning of a legacy of the residential schools. Okay, and eventually, when the territorial government was set up, the federal government also made delegations to the territorial government in all these programs that has to do with health, education, and social services and housing and all those things. So those are drawdowns from the original source while we were wards of government, and we had no say about it, okay? And the purpose of a land claim self-government agreement is to say that, look, we want to have a say on it, and we want to do it by having engagements like this, where we can have a talk, we get to understand each other a little bit more. And so what we're saying here is that the knowledge economy comes from the original source that was never drawn down, but totally ignored, okay? It still continues to be ignored. But one of the headways that we've been making in the most recent years was because our ability to speak on our own behalf now, that we're engaging with, universities, we're engaging with other things because in the North we have issues with health, education, and social services. One, because we never had a say in it, and two, we just followed because we had no choice, and three is that we want to make sure that the North doesn't continue to be built on the basis of the original foundations that ignored the traditional economy that we still continue to hold. And one of the ways of extracting that knowledge economy is through research. And one of the places that we're doing research now is in the spore unit, where, yes, there is a big health issues in the North that the smaller communities aren't engaged in, because the only thing we know about health, even in my generation, is we run the other way anytime we see anybody coming into the community that has a white coat on, okay? And we literally run the other way. And if there's anybody wearing a suit starting to walk around the community, people, even if it's lunchtime or even during the day, they'll lock the doors, close the blinds, and just wait until they finish knocking and go away. And that's the kind of life in some ways continues today. And so what we're doing with the spore work is to encourage the communities to open that door and engage and provide information to partners that we would bring them with on areas that they're interested in doing research in, so that they would have and they're extracting it from the original source before all the drawdowns. And that's where the economy is. And where the economy is today is that that we've been poked and prodded and cast aside, and as if we have nothing to offer, okay? But we have very much to offer, because now what's happening is that when the Indian Act that we're under, we left it in 2005. The Indian Act no longer applies. And so there's, but the policy of those transfers is still based on the old system, meaning that there's no policy of implementation of any agreements within Canada. And so the only policy of engagement that we have now is what we're doing right now, is that we're stepping ahead of ourselves in trying to do an engagement that sets some sort of precedence on how things would happen in this area, in the North. And I think that's very important, because even if you developed a policy, a national policy, you still need to engage. And we have so many jurisdictions, and in the North, the jurisdiction is a lot different than it is in anywhere else, because here we have almost a 50-50 population base, where you have 50% of the population living in larger centers, and the other 50%, which is predominantly Aboriginal, living in the hinterland. Okay, and the object of knowledge economy is to engage for the first time. And one of the things about why I'm talking about this is that we still continue And we're going to continue a long ways into the future of having separate institutions, because we have to remember that in the last 150 years, and with the Indian Act, it's kept the Aboriginal society and the rest of Canadians separate, okay? And the land claim is a recognition of a people that were self-governing and had their economies, and that's what we're trying to raise. That's what we're trying to raise. But through engagements, because we can't do things as it were before, that with the knowledge economy, like with the SPORE unit that we have now, we have a governing council made up of other members from the other regions to have these meetings and to get something going so that the communities can engage. One of the things that we've done with the Clinton government is that we have set up our own entities, and the more prominent ones that we have so far in our early years is the Clinton Research and Training Institute, and we have this institute that's going to start working in engaging with universities to provide a pipeline into those that are willing to take on our students, okay? But preferably, if there's one in the north, we want to engage that way because it's easier to design something up here for ourselves for the north than it is to try to change something in the south other than the higher education that might not be available in the north for some time yet. Even with let's say a good example of engagement is that you would sometimes wonder why a mining company would have an IBE with us, is because they draw down from the treaties. The treaties talk about that the lands will now be opened up for extraction, and so most of their monies went to the northern economy for training and business opportunities and all this kind of stuff, but it didn't trickle to the communities until we started raising our voices, and the only reason it worked was that because the federal minister at the time, when they were totally in control of the regulatory bodies, and they had the final say, that they were saying at the time that we will not give a license until you have an IBA with the people. So they forced it that way. But now we're part of those regulatory bodies as partners. And so there's a lot more that we can do by ourselves, but by doing things by yourself, it just means that we're just working ourselves uphill. And rather than do that, it's better to do it in partnership. What we've done is we've emptied the Indian Act pot that we were eligible for, so that the arrow from the federal government is going directly to the people who are self-governing and are no longer under the Indian Act. So the object is to make the arrow point the other way for once, rather than just strictly drawdowns. But what do we do with the uploads that we're doing now? Do we do it in partnership, or how do we do it? So this is a voice coming from the hinterland to the committee to say, we think that we have some ideas that we would like to engage on, that if there is a polytechnic university or some form of institute up in the north, that we want to have input. We want to have input that allows us to start putting our foot forward rather than being in the dark as we were before. And this is a great opportunity, because one of the things that drives everything nowadays is the 94 calls of action by the big reconciliation thing, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And all I'm saying is that before contact, we had everything that we needed. We had our economies. We didn't need welfare. We're independent. And since the drawdowns, we've lost ownership. Our spirituality is threatened. We're not part of this new economy, and we're not part of the education. We're not part of health. We're just now getting engaged, and all our subsurface resources were squandered, and the benefits have only been trickling in, but only on the basis of jobs, training, and business opportunities. But it doesn't go beyond that, because you're only dealing with developers. But we still need a larger discussion with the authorities. And I think the beginning of those discussions is more in the regulatory authorities now, but not the engagement of the owners of those lands that are being extracted. Those discussions need to happen. So the knowledge economy is a way for the communities to engage for the first time, for the first time, because it not only has the north, not only the north, the lands in the north are being split into these different jurisdictions, and a lot of them hold resources, but the pipeline for those resources cannot be used in the old pipeline of drawdowns that had nothing to do with us. But we're looking at uploads, and this is a good example of that. Upload is a sample of things that are presented this morning. Masicho.
Masi, Mr. Zoe, for your presentation and for the presentation before that. And so at this point, I'm going to open the floor to my colleagues to ask you questions or make comments on the presentations. And Tom had his hand up a while ago. Go, Tom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this is excellent work. this is a lot of this stuff is something that I've talked about many times in the House over the years. I think that there's a huge socioeconomic benefits to spending money in small communities, whether it be on research or any type of spending. I look at one of the really untapped economies is the conservation economy. And you look at what the federal government has tried to do with the conservation economy. In the first budget, they had put $500 million into conservation economy. In the second budget, it was $1.3 billion. And I had started to realize that when the Polytech University was being discussed, and I just one point when you said it'd bring tens of millions, I've always felt it would bring hundreds of millions of dollars into the economy. And when that began to discussions on that started, we could really see that the delivery was wrong, and that it turned Fort Smith against the idea because they felt that they were going to be losing their college. I saw it as an opportunity to say there's an opportunity to turn Fort Smith into, it's ideally located right next to a park, and into a conservation school. And I've talked about that in the Legislative Assembly also, to build a conservation school in Fort Smith that will use the National Indigenous Guardianship Network, along with our own environment and natural resources, rangers, whoever is out there, includes Salke, Nihatlitana, and I think the DETRO has a guardianship program as well, and possibly the SATU for the biosphere. And you look at all of those things, and it appeared as though somebody did some sort of socioeconomic modeling and indicated that for every dollar spent towards the conservation, but specific to the Nihatlitana, you were getting reducing social spending by $2.50. They did a socioeconomic model on the guardianship program in Australia, and for every dollar spent there, they were saving $3.70 in social spending. So this is something that I've always wanted someone, and you guys seem to be perfectly situated to do it, was to develop those type of socioeconomic models that show the government that it's ridiculous that you guys don't want to spend money in these untapped economic areas like small communities. Because what the government is doing is they're increasing social spending. And that's just going to be, it's a pitfall, right? They're going to eventually just go into a situation where they can't borrow anymore, and they can't afford to spend anymore. And they haven't developed the conservation or economy, knowledge economy, or any economy in small communities to be able to take advantage of it and start to turn the tide on how this type of spending will benefit all of the Northwest Territories. I've always felt that anything that, especially like a university, in Yellowknife would benefit the whole North, because many of the people in NWT have difficulty paying for students to go to university down south. And I know that it is costly, and even though the NWT probably has the best programs in the whole country, even with that, it's still difficult to do that. So I just I'm sitting here listening, and I guess I realize that all of the stuff you're talking about, the jobs and knowledge economy, both of you talked about, and then I have this thing that I've been always talking about, and I think the federal government even had supported the idea of pumping money into home care, which is kind of strange because people think, well, I was just trying to help old people, but when you look at the whole economy of home care, it's probably one of the greatest benefits, socio-economic benefits you can have. You keep the people in the communities, you keep the elders in the community, you keep that knowledge in the communities, you build relationship between elders and youth in communities, and it's just it's got so many benefits, but it's so difficult to get the government to bite the bullet, spend the money there. They would rather save the money and then just slowly go into the hole, as opposed to spending the money to take themselves out and taking aggressive steps. And I think this type of presentation, I don't know if you guys have presented this stuff to the government, but you should if you haven't, because I think it's, and I don't know if people would listen. I can't say that they would. I know that I felt that the old Stanton Hospital should become a nursing school, and then you look at the benefits of having producing home care workers and registered nurses out of a place like Stanton Hospital. The old Stanton Hospital has great benefits, even with the 72 long-term care patients that are going in there. That's ideal. That's absolutely ideal for people to be trained from the communities into that and then go back to their communities to run home care programs. So I think all of this is excellent. I think that not only will a Polytech University positively impact something like a potential conservation school in Fort Smith, it will also have huge benefits for Arctic Research Institute in Inuvik. I think that'll give that community or that institute an opportunity to focus on research. And you mentioned the satellite. We know that building the fiber optic up the Mackenzie Valley has huge benefits to Inuvik. And Inuvik is probably more blessed, and I don't know the term, but technically or communication. They have the best. They are in the best location, and because of the location of the satellites in the world. That's not just Canada, but in the entire world. It should be the best, easiest place to communicate in Inuvik, and that could be an opportunity built up there, and the Arctic Research Council will be something that will be hugely beneficial to the territory and to the education of our people in NWT. I do have one question, though, Julie. Madam Chair, I'd like to, going back to my very initial comment on socio-economic model, you guys have the ability to do socio-economic models when you're presenting this type of thing and the impacts or the increase of the economy through the knowledge economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Would one of you like to respond to that question? Go ahead.
All right. I'll respond. Thank you. And I completely agree with you. And I think you had amazing ideas. And those are certainly the sorts of things we're hearing in the communities as well. With respect to our ability to do economic modeling, because we're health focused, we don't have a mandate to do that. And because we do have an advocacy mandate, this is where this paper came out of. But I think, like a lot of organizations, we're pretty strapped for time, and this was sort of a pet project of mine over several months that I was doing off the side of my desk. And about that, we only scratched the surface with this paper. So you mentioned things like communication infrastructure, some of the other sectors like the whole conservation piece. In this paper, we only focused on social science and health research. So what we're seeing just in this one element of the knowledge economy is pretty significant. So if there were economic modeling that could take into account conservation, the Guardians program kind of things, the infrastructure that's required, all of the research that's being done, through ENR and through the wildlife management boards and the co-management boards. Like, there's a lot happening out there, and with a polytechnic, it could really play a significant role bringing all those things together. I'm really of the view that GNWT should employ an economist. They should have a central agency that analyzes the economy here. And I know that they did fund the Conference Board of Canada at one point to do that type of analysis. I don't know where that's gone, but I think that's one of the major problems with the government of the Northwest Territories is they don't have economists on staff whose job it is to do this kind of economic modeling. And I think that's something that I would put that to MLAs when you do your budgets every year. Where's the economist? Who's thinking of putting all these things together? Why aren't the people in charge of the university talking about to the department that owns the old hospital and talking about those kinds of ideas? Because that's certainly, I think, what people want and expect. And it's really difficult to just sit back and only be able to watch this stuff. So this paper really only scratches the surface, and I'm glad to hear that there has been thinking. And the other thing is, I think until this paper was written, and it was written largely in response to, the debate around the university seemed to be, oh my gosh, we might lose like a dozen jobs in Fort Smith, and so that should bring this project to a grinding halt. And it just seemed, legitimate for sure on Fort Smith's behalf, but in terms of holding back a significant element of a whole economic sector, to a lot of people really didn't make any sense. So the challenge and the discussion, and I know that CBC in particular frames this whole thing as a Yellowknife versus Fort Smith, and when you talk to people involved, that's really not what's going on, so that's unfortunate. But the conversation needs to be elevated, I think, and we need to be talking about that. What will elevate it is to talk about the kinds of things that you have just articulated, because I think you really do have, a sense, like a really strong sense, a good sense of what people are talking about out there.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Corey.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for coming and presenting today. I will be the first to admit, and I think as a government we would admit that the terminology even of knowledge agenda, knowledge economy is very much early days and in its infancy as it relates to our government's use of it. Although, technically knowledge agenda or knowledge economy is traditional economy, been around for thousands of years with Indigenous people. So kind of shed some light, I guess, to some degree on where we're at in working towards self-determination in some way, and just now starting to realize what traditional knowledge has to offer in terms of building what we're now terming as kind of the knowledge economy. One thing that I just want to shed some light on quickly before I expand a little bit more is that you may be aware that the government did release its knowledge agenda last May, and is currently working on an action plan relevant to this. And I don't know, but I'm very hopeful that they will be engaging with folks like yourselves and others in order to develop their action plan. Of course, they're going to engage us as well at some point, but it's we've only just gotten early indicators on that, and so it's funny because the knowledge agenda is something where we all know we have this underlying thing where we really are all excited about what opportunities lie with the knowledge agenda, but it is not black and white. is very gray area that no one can really capture. As you've mentioned a number of times, there's a lot of people doing a lot of great things. Some of the institutes we've talked about are yourselves, Deshenta, Dene Naho, Foxy, the Indigenous Wellness Center. They're all doing these great, amazing things, and we just are struggling with a way in which to capture them all, how to network them in a way that's going to, have us all kind of collaborating and working together. One of the things that I find is that as a territory, the Northwest Territories is odd as it relates to the rest of Canada, that we seem kind of lost in limbo a little bit. We really kind of lack some identity. Well, as a territory, holistically, individual Indigenous peoples certainly are at various stages of working towards self-determination and doing, they have their own vision and goals and objectives and what have you. And, let's just say the Inuvialuit and the Gwich'in maybe are working on their own vision and don't necessarily align with that of, say, the Dehcho, and the Dehcho don't necessarily align with that of the Klecho, because they're all at these various stages of working towards self-determination, and that's understandable, and I think that's a necessary thing that we're going through. But in the meantime, as a territory, we kind of lack this ability to kind of pull together and unite for a grander territory-wide vision. What does it mean to be a territory resident of whatever kind, and what does it mean, who are we as a people, and what is our contribution to this country and the Confederation, is a difficult question to answer. I in fact can't even see it right now, and I don't see a vision for the territory. And so the reason why I raise these things is because I think it's important that we start to work on some common values throughout the entire territory that we can all kind of agree upon. What are those things that are going to shape our territory for the next generations to come? That no matter whether you're a Inuvialuit, a Quechua, Klecho, Dehcho, or whatever, or non-Indigenous, what are those values? I see a few. I see certainly self-determination is one of those things that no matter where you live in the territory, that's a value we're all working toward. Economic engine, we've got to find a way to create opportunity, prosperity, keep the lights on, or or else we just are not going to be able to stick around and have these meaningful discussions. Innovation and technology is a major piece of this that I'm not 100% sure how it's going to play in yet. But I do know that innovation technology at the pace in which it's moving is going to create benefit, but also going to create a lot of chaos. It already is. And we've got to find a way through our knowledge agenda to make sure that we're involved in the innovation and technology piece, or we're going to get left behind. And we're already left behind in a number of various areas. Globalization is a thing now for the Northwest Territories. I remember growing up as a kid, there would be all these boom-bust cycles going on around Canada and Alberta and this sort of thing, and we would never feel anything here. Now, I say that respectfully because while that might have been good for my parents and myself, it was not necessarily good for Indigenous folks at that time. And then lastly, I see one of those common things that are going to influence us over the coming decades clearly is climate change. And so, if we put those 5 things together, whether it's self-determination, economic engine, innovation technology, globalization, and climate change, as far as I can tell, those are going to be the major shapers of our territory over the next generations to come. Within those categories, or those values, or whatever we want to call them, are all of those pieces: health, education, economic, arts, culture, heritage, all these sorts of things. And what I really like that you shared with John, because it was kind of an aha moment for me today, is this idea of, you reference the term often about downloading and uploading. And I think that's the common language being used today is devolution. And that what you're suggesting is maybe there needs to be a new reinvention of devolution, and especially as we work towards self-determination, what will it look like to pass on responsibility, let's say, or maybe it's not passing on responsibility. Maybe it's Indigenous governments once and for all teaching territorial governments and federal governments that, you know what, the underlying responsibilities of Indigenous people of this territory have always been there. We've just been operating off of your rules for the last couple hundred years. Here's the way in which we now have to recognize how the real uploading of responsibility or devolution of responsibility should look like. I know I'm a bit all over the map here, but that's because this is the nature of knowledge economy in this discussion, is it kind of can go everywhere. I'm extremely excited, however, to start having this discussion because myself and I believe the colleagues in this building and the government as a whole need to really start to inform ourselves a little bit better in with regard to the knowledge economy, and I'm excited to see how it'll shape out over the next number of years and next number of governments, both here with the territorial government, but of course in collaboration with the Indigenous people of the territory. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your comments. Before I go to Kevin, does anyone on the phone want to be put on the list?
Julie Shane here. No, I'm good with everything so far. Thanks.
Okay. I'll move.
I'm good as well. Some of the questions I wanted to ask have already asked, so that's good.
Okay, thanks, Sunny. So I'll move on now to Kevin, and we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. Thank you.
Thanks. That's Julie's subtle way of telling me to go quickly. Look, this stuff is music to my ears. You know that I've made a bunch of statements in the House about knowledge economy and post-secondary education renewal and so on. So I'll just run through a few things here. As you probably know, we did change the mandate of the government at the midterm, and we did add a commitment to knowledge economy, development of a knowledge economy, and there is a commitment to develop I think a strategy and action plan around that. Corey mentioned it, so I think this is very good timing. And anything that I can do, anything that you folks can do to get our cabinet off the roads to resources paradigm, I'm happy to support. And I wish you were all in cabinet. So there's some subtle hints there as well. I do want to say that you made a number of very good and concrete recommendations about what the strategy should look like. So I would encourage you to try to present to cabinet at some point. Certainly talk to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, who is going to be hiring an associate deputy minister for post-secondary education renewal. As I understand, the first step is going to be a visioning process, and I would highly encourage you folks to get engaged and involved in that process, and it'll eventually run out into a plan for post-secondary education and feasibility work and so on. So I would encourage you to get engaged and involved in that process. And Stephanie, you know all this stuff already. So you did mention that you wish that GNWT had economists. We actually do. I don't know what they do. There's 2 senior economists in ITI. I don't know exactly what they do. We've got a Bureau of Statistics. There's 9 people there. I would think that somehow those are the sorts of people that can and should start to track some of this this information along with the Aurora Research Institute in Inuvik. I have a couple of specific questions. I did have a very quick look at the Scientists Act and the regulations, which really date from the 1920s, and they were really put in place to try to promote Canadian sovereignty and keep pesky foreign researchers out of the Northwest Territories, or at least we knew what was going on. There was a guy by the name of McMillan who was an American research exploration philanthropist guy, and he kept coming up here and we didn't even know what he was doing. So they put this in place to try to license him to find out where he was going and what he was doing. But the legislation really hasn't changed in any significant way since the 1920s. So that is a very good suggestion, and there's no reason why the Aurora Research Institute shouldn't be asking, what the investment that a researcher intends to make, or the institution, and what the benefits were and so on, and begin to compile and track that information and pass it on to the Stats Bureau and so on. So I'm just wondering if you have any specific ideas about how the Scientists Act can and should be reviewed or improved on. I've given you some ideas for myself, but I'm curious to hear from you folks how that process could be improved. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. Would you like to respond, Stephanie?
Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. In terms of the Scientists Act, there are a number in the discussion paper, which Rachel printed out, and also there's a really great Clecho government USB that has all these materials. There's some pretty specific suggestions for the Scientists Act. I have lots of ideas. Being a researcher, having been in communities advising people who have been asked by researchers to do research, having kind of a high level where I do work with the funding councils as an adjudicator on funding applications and whatnot, and just understanding, taking a real focus on the economic approach. So it would be as simple as just putting additional questions on research licensing. I think that would be a very easy thing to do. It's interesting that you mentioned the economists. GNWT needs central agency economists. I know there might be a couple, like there's a health economist or someone with that qualification in the Department of Health. There's a couple people in ITI. We have the Stats Bureau. I haven't had a chance to look at the new Statistics Act, the bill that's coming before the Assembly. But I really think one concrete measure that could be put in place would have a central agency economist looking at these kinds of issues. The Scientists Act, I think ARI, probably the Department of Health, Department of Education, they would probably all have ideas about how that should be overhauled. But really for us, it's something as simple as, if we can understand how much money is SSHRC giving out to the north, or how much money is CIHR giving to the north, and if CIHR has $1 billion, but they're only giving $1 million a year to the NWT, that would enable organizations like mine to go to CIHR and say, we think we should get more of your $1 billion. We think that $1 million is not enough, and that you need to put, quotas on, or some sort of percentage that matches population. Or say CIHR, if you have, 3% of your researchers, or 5% of your researchers focused on research in the NWT, and the total value of that research is $100 million, but only $1 million of that is coming to the NWT. That's a problem. So we can start having those conversations with federal government agencies that would represent new sources of money, and we can't have them right now because we don't know. And GNWT doesn't track it, they don't care. There's no incentive for them to track it. But it would be as simple as just putting additional questions onto ARI licensing. And quite frankly, we need GNWT involved. This is something that we can try to do on our own. But if GNWT and Indigenous governments and NGOs partner together, the argument is made that much stronger. If we can approach things together, if all of us could go to CIHR and say, we want 10% of your money, we would have a much better chance of getting that than if GNWT goes, or if Hotii goes, or just the Clecho government goes. So we need to be a bit more strategic. The legislation piece, it's about revising regulations, and it's about talking to people, doing this work, and getting their advice on these regulations. So setting up the right processes. The other thing I would recommend is that people need to be a little more entrepreneurial, and every time government is thinking about doing something, should be asking itself, what is the potential economic benefit of doing this or not doing this? Because we see, things like if the Clecho government has a research institute and they need $100,000 to hire someone to raise money and write research proposals. If GWT were to just come up with $100,000 and give it to TRTI, that could potentially see hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, of new money coming into the NWT. So it's really talking to people involved and coming up with ideas, some of the ideas that MLA Bolio talked about, and really thinking of those, and then thinking about how can our legislation enable that? Because it seems like clearly when they first wrote the Scientists Act, they did have a policy goal in mind. But what's the policy goal now? And so we need to think about legislation going backwards from where do we want to be? What are the steps to get there? How does legislation feed into that process?
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, Kevin.
I'm all right, thanks.
Okay, awesome. So with that, we will bring this meeting to an end. We'd like to thank you very much for coming and presenting your paper and engaging us in this conversation. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting. Masi.